Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning to some. My name is Keshia Pollack Porter, and I have the great privilege of being the chair of the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I have the privilege of being the moderator of today's webinar, and I thank you all for tuning in. In our time together today, we are going to try to unpack the complex and deadly intersection of white supremacy, political violence, guns, and the Second Amendment. We will touch upon the events and the aftermath of the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, U.S. trends and the willingness to engage in political violence, the role of the Second Amendment and gun laws, including quote unquote stand your ground laws. And we will end with some promising solutions to mitigate this cycle of racism and hatred. The importance of today's conversation is especially timely given the recent violent attack of Pelosi, which was an act of political violence and tool of white supremacy in the same way the January 6th attack on the Capitol was. White supremacists are using violence and intimidation as tools in an attempt to limit voting, civic participation, and exercise of power by Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Hunting Speaker Pelosi in the Capitol with the intent to harm her and now seeking to cause her and her family harm in their home are sending the same overt message we heard from white supremacist marchers in Charlottesville in 2017 and also on January 6th. We have an outstanding lineup of panelists who I'll briefly introduce. You'll find their full bios in the chat as they speak. And how we're going to approach our time together today is that each speaker will give some brief opening remarks, and then we will have ample time for questions. Please feel free to insert questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout our discussion, and we will get to as many questions as we can during our time today. Let me begin by introducing our panelists. We are expecting U.S. Representative Jamie Raskin to join us. Served as a U.S. representative for Maryland's 8th Congressional District since 2017. And Representative Raskin currently serves as a member of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Darrell Miller is the Duke University Melvin D. Shimm Professor of Law. He's also the author of The Positive Second Amendment Rights, Regulation, and the Future of Heller. Lilliana Mason is the Johns Hopkins SNF Agora Institute Associate Professor of Political Science. He's the co-author of Radical American Partisanship, Mapping Violent Hostility, Its Causes, and the Consequences for Democracy. Carey is the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions Law and Policy Advisor. He co-authored a report from the former Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence earlier this year entitled Defending Democracy, Addressing the Dangers of Armed Insurrection. We're going to begin today with Darrell. Please open with your comments.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I only have about 6 minutes. Let me get you to the executive summary, which is unquestionably gun regulation has a racist history, but so does gun rights. Unquestionably, gun regulation has disparate impacts on communities of color, but so does lack of gun regulation. So let me unpack this. The Second Amendment itself does not say much about race. It says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But there is a long tradition going back to the slave codes of disarming free Blacks and enslaved persons. But equally, there is a long tradition of whites using private personal arms to act as a kind of privatized police of Black persons and communities of colors in the slave patrol. And indeed, while in the North, the major concern was with the rebellions, populist rebellions, like in Western Massachusetts, the Shays Rebellion, some of the audience might be familiar with. In the South, when you talk about something like a rebellion, the major concern is something about enslaved persons rising up to try to free themselves, as happened in Charleston, South Carolina, with the Stono Rebellion, which is roughly contemporaneous with the ratification of the Second Amendment in 1791. So much so that, as Carl Bogus and Carol Anderson have documented, persons like Patrick Henry, one of the founding fathers, is quite vocal about the concern about disarming the militia because it would impede the southern states' ability to suppress slave insurrections. So gun regulation has a racist history, but so does gun rights. Fast forward to Reconstruction, same dynamic is at play. Right after the Civil War, part of the Black Codes, these special post-Civil War enactments imposed specially racially denominated requirements for licenses for Blacks to own and carry weapons. And by the way, it's not just on weapons, but to do things like apply a trade, special taxes, to get licenses to apply a trade, for example, or taxes to do so. But this was married by claims by whites of an unfettered right to carry private arms and to stop and investigate Black people. Indeed, when the Klan is prosecuted for terrorism in the South, in South Carolina, in around 1871, 72, they claim that they have essentially an inalienable right, traditional right, to take their private arms, to carry them across the county in self-defense, as a self-appointed sort of peace patrol to harass and injure Black people. So again, gun regulation has a racist history, but so does the gun rights. What about today? Well, as the Bronx defenders in this recent case called Bruin highlighted, there is a concern with partial enforcement of gun laws, but that's only part of the equation, because as the NAACP brief indicated, there's also a disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities with regard to gun violence. You're 20 times more likely to die as a young Black man as a result of gun violence than a comparable white male. Psychological evidence has demonstrated repeatedly that Black men are perceived as a threat when not armed, giving rise to the erroneous use of weapons by private parties in so-called stand your ground conditions. So yes, gun regulation has a disparate impact on racial minorities, but so does gun rights. My conclusion is that we have to be attentive to that aspect of gun rights that are enlisted to maintain white supremacy as much as we have to be cautious that gun regulations does not replicate racial oppression. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Darrell, for those comments. Really important points to start this conversation off today. Next, I want to turn to Representative Raskin to make some comments, and please post any questions for Representative Raskin in the chat. He'll need to leave a little early from our session, so we'll make some time for some questions after his comments. So Representative Raskin will please join us for some comments.
And thank you so much for having me and for conducting this important session on the convergence of violent white nationalism and gun violence, and the extraordinary gun violence that America continues to experience, which is quite unique in terms of the industrialized world. I'm alarmed by a seeming spreading indulgence and tolerance for both the kind of political violence that we saw on January 6th, which was inflamed by white nationalism and racism, but also for just the extraordinary episodes of nihilistic gun violence and terror that have beset American society, from elementary schools to Walmarts to grocery stores, and so on. So, but in just these few minutes, what I wanted to take on was a kind of political and constitutional cover that I see some of my colleagues giving to insurrectionist and violent type politics in the country. And I began to notice soon after January 6th that a lot of my GOP colleagues would refer to the idea that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to give the people the right to overthrow the government. And so there could be no limits on what private arsenals are possessed by private citizens, because each citizen needs a complete arsenal matching that of the federal government or the state government, because the purpose of the Second Amendment is to allow the people to engage in violence against government officials who they consider to be tyrants. And so I have been working very hard to try to counter this this kind of polemical and ideological the subversion of our real Constitution. And I generally start in committee sessions or on the floor if somebody goes off on one of these tangents, just by reading them the relevant provisions of the Constitution that completely repudiate and reject this interpretation of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution says that Congress has the power to call forth the militias in order to do three things: enforce the laws, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. The next clause, of course, gives the states the power to appoint the officers of the militias, and then Congress the power to organize and arm and discipline the militias. So this counteracts the complementary idea that the people are always the militia, and so the people can just pick up guns and use them against police officers or against the state. But the Constitution is very clear that the militias are organized by the states and then ultimately by Congress, which has power over them. The Republican Guarantee Clause says that the Congress shall guarantee to the people of the states a Republican form of government and assist them in putting down domestic violence. Far from, giving the people the power to generate domestic violence, Congress and the states have the power to put it down. The treason clause of the Constitution defines treason as levying arms against the United States or giving aid and comfort to the enemies of the United States. And then, of course, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which you think some of my colleagues would be familiarizing themselves with, says that anybody who swears an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic, but violates that oath by engaging in insurrection or rebellion shall forfeit the right to ever hold office again at the federal or state level. So we have all of these definitive textual rejections of the idea that our Constitution protects the right to overthrow the Constitution or overthrow the government of the United States. And against that, they cite only the Second Amendment in the most general terms. There's nothing in the text of it which would suggest that it gives anybody the right to overthrow the government. The Second Amendment, of course, talks about a well-regulated militia, and that means regulated by the government, not by the Oath Boys or the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys or the 3%ers or what have you. It's got to be regulated by the government. And then, the only other two arguments that I've ever heard by colleagues trying to salvage that thesis is one, they will cite Patrick Henry for the proposition that give me liberty or give me death, which was a moving slogan, of course, by an anti-federalist. Patrick Henry opposed the Constitution precisely because he thought that it gave too much power to the federal government and preempted the right of the people to overthrow the government. And then the final thing they say is, well, the Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human events, a government turns tyrannical and there's a specific litany of grievances, then the people have the right to overthrow the government. That they do. And this is the closest thing to a real argument they have, but they completely misunderstand their point, because the Declaration of Independence was based on an invocation of natural law and natural rights. It was not an appeal to the Magna Carta or the British Constitution. And it would be equally absurd and ridiculous to cite the US Constitution for the proposition that we have the right to overthrow the US Constitution. There's nothing in the text or structure or precedent of our Constitution which suggests that. So if you really believe that just conducting a presidential election and having your candidate lose by 7 million votes is a form of tyranny, then have at it. You can try to overthrow the government, but if you fail and you are frustrated in that effort, then you will be prosecuted and you will go to jail, as more than 950 January 6th insurrectionists have been, and there have been 0 charges dismissed by federal courts on the grounds that the Second Amendment or any other part of the Constitution gives you a right to engage in insurrection to overthrow the government. So I think it's just going to be important for us to underscore this point. This is not how our system of government works, and you have no more right to go and beat people up or hit them over the head with a hammer or shoot them than you have a right to conduct an insurrection against the government, and nor do you have a right to possess nuclear weapons or semi-automatic military-style assault weapons because you think you have the right to overthrow the government. The Constitution does not stand for that principle. I yield back.
Right. Thank you so much, Representative Raskin. Your comments are really resonating with the audience, and I thought maybe I'd ask just a couple questions, both knowing that you needed to head out early. I mean, one thing that I continue to ask is, what do we need to do, we being political leaders, legislators, community leaders, citizens, to prevent another January 6th or something like it? What are your perspectives on this?
Well, in our final report, which we're working on right now, the January 6th committee will make a series of recommendations about how we need to fortify ourselves, both in terms of physical security, but also in terms of electoral security to protect the operations of government, and then just more generally, the security of democracy and freedom against this somewhat frightful new century we're in, where democracy and freedom are under attack all over the world. So we clearly need to fortify electoral and political institutions against coups, insurrections, electoral sabotage, and political violence. And we will be suggesting very specific ways to do that. But everybody needs to be standing up for democratic institutions wherever you are, whether we're talking about, a school board in Alaska, or we're talking about the right of women to have health care in Kansas, or we're talking about the right of people to vote in Georgia, or wherever you are. People need to be standing up for the institutions of democracy.
Well, we will eagerly look forward to seeing the report, and thank you for naming the importance of democracy and freedom being under attack at this present time. Clearly there are elections next week. People are sort of anxious about that, and there's a question around, depending on the midterm outcomes, do you see any opportunities for new gun safety regulations on the horizon?
Well, I do. I mean, our essential problem, of course, is that 80 or 90% of the people support the basic building block gun safety regulations we've been fighting for, such as a universal background check on violent criminals to close the loopholes in the Brady legislation. So we would close the internet loophole, close the private gun show loophole, and so on. And that's overwhelmingly favored by everybody across party lines, gun owners, non-gun owners, and so on. But it has run into a brick wall because of the filibuster on the Senate side. So if sufficient new senators were to join the Senate who are interested in overcoming the power of the filibuster to shut down overwhelmingly popular common sense gun legislation, then we would be able to move forward on that. And I'm hopeful that that's where we will be, after November the 9th.
Yeah, thank you so much, Representative Raskin. And so the final question I'll just ask for you now before we head over to our next panelist is, clearly Darrell talked a lot about the role of the Klan and racism, and we sort of think about what happened on January 6th. And a lot of people talk about January 6th as primarily being described as an act of political violence. When you think about that day and what you saw and what we all saw, do you also see it as an act of racial and anti-Semitic violence, or how do you sort of think about that aspect of what happened on that day?
Well, it was certainly political violence in the sense that it was strategic and tactical in order to overthrow the result of the 2020 presidential election. But it was pervaded with racism and white nationalism neo-Nazism and other racist ideologies. I mean, in some sense, you could view that as underlying the whole political project, because the basic concept is the only votes that really matter are white votes, and it's the white majority that gets to govern. So that if you have a multiracial majority that includes lots of white people and African Americans and Hispanics and Asian Americans and so on, and that produces a candidate who's at odds with the choice of just the white community as a majority vote, then there's something flawed with the election, and there must have been fraud. There must have been corruption. But of course, more than 60 federal and state courts rejected every allegation of electoral corruption, electoral fraud in the country. And yet there was this frenzied and deranged determination that somehow the election had been stolen away from the rightful victor, Donald Trump. And these people were out for blood, and several people died that day. 150 of our police officers on the Capitol Force and the Metropolitan Police Department force were injured, wounded, hospitalized with broken ribs, broken jaws, noses, necks, missing fingers, traumatic brain injuries, heart attack, strokes, post-traumatic stress syndrome, you name it. This was a seriously violent attack, and there were thousands of firearms that were brought to Washington by the insurrectionists, some of which were physically present during the attack, but most of them had been left, fortunately, in Virginia by the insurrectionists, who were afraid of the District of Columbia's much stricter gun laws. And they spoke about this quite openly in their, internet chats and their, various apps and so on. So, we dodged what could have been a far greater massacre, and we could have been looking at something much more like a civil war if it had gone one step further. So it's very difficult to disentangle what was political violence and what was racial violence. It was all interwoven on that day.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Raskin, and thank you for ending your comments by punctuating the important intersection of these issues, which is why we're here talking about this topic today. So thank you for that. Let me move to Lilliana for some comments to the conversation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm actually just going to set the scene with some data that I've been collecting with Nathan Calmo since 2017 on violence in the U.S. electorate. So actually, American scholars of American politics haven't asked very serious questions about how dangerous American partisanship can be. We've always sort of assumed that it's a benign sort of, at worst, an identity. But we decided to start asking some more serious questions of Americans in 2017. Particularly related to these types of questions that are called moral disengagement, which basically is the set of attitudes that tend to precede mass violence in other places. So when there is genocide, when there's mass intergroup violence in other places, we tend to see people thinking of the other group that they're harming as a threat, as evil, and as subhuman. And so we've been collecting these data for now 5 years. This is updated all the way to this past spring, to May of 2022. And actually what we were seeing even in 2017 was a lot higher than we expected to see, with 60% of Democrats and Republicans thinking the other party is a threat to the United States. That has now gone up to above 70% among Republicans and about 70% among Democrats. Thinking that the other party is not just wrong for politics, they're downright evil. We started off at about 40% of partisans and have since moved, even higher than that, up to getting over 50%. And then the dehumanization, also quite concerning, starting around 20%, and now looking like it's above 30% for both Democrats and Republicans. Throughout, we're actually seeing that Democrats and Republicans are, Republicans tend to hold these views a lot more, somewhat more than Democrats, but they aren't significantly different. One of the things we wanted to figure out was why people are holding these issues. And so we asked people a set of questions measuring a concept we call racial resentment, which is a pretty common concept in the study of American political behavior. Basically, what it says is, other immigrants have worked their way up. Why haven't Black Americans been as successful as them? Whatever economic inequality Black Americans are suffering from is their fault. It's not because of anything systemic. And so what you see on the left here is that, the average scores on 0 to 1 of racial resentment are Democrats tend to be much lower than Republicans, scoring 0.3, while Republicans score 0.7. But the really interesting part here is if you look at these are predicted values of those moral disengagement questions. And what we see here is that for Republicans, higher levels of racial resentment are very strongly connected to their feelings that Democrats are evil and a threat and animals. The Republicans who are the lowest in racial resentment actually are down here are some of the most tolerant people in our sample. So this is, for them, it's sort of a cross pressure because they actually feel something in common with Democrats. For Democrats, it's the opposite relationship. It's not as strong, but it's the opposite relationship, where the Democrats who are the lowest in racial resentment are the ones who are the most likely to think of Republicans as threats, as evil, as not human. And this, I should mention, is this figure is entirely white respondents. So it's all white Democrats and white Republicans. We also asked people about their actual support explicitly for partisan violence. When is it ever acceptable to use violence to achieve political goals? And in 2017, those attitudes were less than 10% among Republicans and Democrats. What we saw is throughout the Trump presidency, Democrats were slightly higher in approval. And then as soon as power of the White House switched, we see Republicans much more approving of Democrats. So it does seem to be a function of which party is in power. But it's important to note that these violent attitudes are related to those prior moral disengagement attitudes that I was showing you. So people who vilify and disengage and dehumanize people in the other party are also more likely to hold these violent views. And that happens especially among people who are already high in aggression, just regular aggressiveness every day. Have you ever hit a person? Do you get in fights easily? We've also asked, I'm almost finished. We've also asked about very specific types of violence because the word violence can be very kind of, different people can interpret it in different ways. So in April of 2022, we asked people about specific types of violence. So is it acceptable to get into fistfights for achieving political goals? Republicans tend to be slightly more approving of getting into physical altercations than Democrats. Democrats are much more approving of property damage that doesn't harm humans. Although this third category of assassination of leaders, we see this like troubling, similar support among both Democrats and Republicans for potentially assassinating leaders. And the last thing that I'm going to show you is we ran an experiment where we had people either read a quote from Joe Biden or Donald Trump that basically said violence is never acceptable in a democracy. This is not how we do government in a democracy. We don't use violence. And so the blue line is the people who read that message, and the gray line is the people who didn't read anything at all. And what we found as people were the sort of the strongest partisans, people who felt most identified with their party, were really dissuaded from approving of violence after reading this one simple message from either Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And these are the people, if you look at the gray line, who normally are the most approving of violence, right? If they hadn't read that message, the strongest partisans were the most approving of violence. If they do read it, they tend to listen. So leaders have a very, very important role to play here. And part of the reason that we're seeing sort of similar levels of approval of violence between Democrats and Republicans, but very different levels of actual political violence occurring in the United States, where the vast majority of it is from the right, is partially because the rhetoric coming from Republican leaders doesn't condemn violence as a political tactic. And the rhetoric that we see coming from Democrats in general is much more explicit about saying violence is never acceptable, is never a tool to be used in a democracy. So I'm going to stop there and happy to take questions later.
Great. Thank you so much, Lilliana, and thank you for presenting these fascinating data. If you're interested in looking more at the data, the link to the book where the data are located is in the chat. Let me turn it to Tim now for some comments before we open it up to questions for the entire group.
Greetings all. I want to reiterate a point that Representative Raskin made very clear earlier in his statements, that the Second Amendment does not and never has protected a right to armed political violence. I argued as much in my Defending Democracy report that I co-authored at the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence at the beginning of the year, and the same remains true today. I will say, though, as Darrell Miller referenced, the conversation about political violence and arms occurs within the backdrop of some recent, very significant action by the Supreme Court, and that is the June 2022 New York Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin case, which for the first time in legal history explicitly acknowledged a right to carry handguns outside of the home for self-defense purposes. But what's most important about that case's holding to this discussion today is that the case dramatically changed how Second Amendment cases are analyzed by courts. And so that being said, we plan to update our Defending Democracy report in 2023 to address the Supreme Court's new test, current events, and other legal developments. But I do want to stress that our principal recommendations in that report will remain unchanged. All of our prior recommendations are still constitutional, effectual, and pragmatic means of reducing and preventing the risk of political armed violence. And though we may expand upon that list, I'll share the policies that we know legislators on the federal and state levels can advance now with the right advocacy and political will. So our principal policy recommendations are as follows. And first and foremost is to regulate the public carry of firearms. The most effectual means of doing so, as we found through our research at the Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions, is focusing on firearm purchaser licensing that involves certain criteria such as fingerprinting requirements to ensure that firearms are not possessed by prohibited persons who are at risk of violence or are illicitly distributed through illegal arms trafficking channels. We're also looking to recommend the strengthening of existing laws and the increased enforcement of current laws that prohibit paramilitary style activity. And this activity kind of can go akin to some of the groups that Representative Raskin was speaking of earlier. When you think of the Proud Boys or Three Percenters, they're groups that undergo military style training and parading and attempts to show armed force that is not accountable to any form of government or elected officials. So these are unaccountable civilian-led groups that threaten democracy and public safety, as we've seen during the insurrection on January 6th, but also in various news reports trickling through the ground since then, and the revelations that have come to light on the January 6th committee panel's work. The third recommendation is limiting guns in locations essential to political participation, such as polling places, vote counting centers, legislative buildings, political protests, and more, to help protect the essential functions of government, civil rights and liberties, and once again, public welfare. Even though there are voter intimidation laws that are explicit within federal law and also codified in many state laws, we found in practice that when it comes to the carrying of firearms and intimidation laws, they can be harder to demonstrate to courts because intimidation laws require showings of intent. You have to show that the person meant to intimidate someone or intended to strike fear in the heart of someone trying to participate in our democratic systems. Whereas, especially given that more and more states are deregulating firearm carry and possession, there are more firearms in public spaces now than there have ever been at any point in our nation's history. And that can complicate the narrative of, well, is this person carrying a firearm to expressly intimidate someone, or are they carrying a firearm for some other reason that's not tied to this crime? So that's where very explicit place and time-based prohibitions are the most effectual. because you're either carrying a firearm in a prohibited space and time or you are not. And the Supreme Court explicitly acknowledged the existence of sensitive places, such as polling places, government buildings, courthouses, legislatures, schools, and more, where firearms can be constitutionally limited. And so it's important that we codify those into law so that both the public firearms carriers know where they cannot possess their firearms and implicate the law, as well as the public can be assured that they can go to specific places without the risk of armed violence. The fourth recommendation is the utilization of extreme risk protection orders to temporarily disarm persons at high risk of violence. Some of these laws are colloquially referred to as red flag laws, and they are where courts can temporarily prohibit the possession of a firearm or the purchasing of firearms from a person deemed by a court through a hearing to pose a significant danger of causing injury to self or others by possessing firearms. And we've seen in Washington state specifically how implementation of these civil protective orders can help disarm and thus prevent instances of exceptionally likely political violence from occurring before it does. And the last of the policy recommendations that we currently have, and again, this list may expand, is the repealing or the creation of exceptions to state preemption laws. And state preemption laws are essentially where state governments create boundaries of regulation that local governments cannot overstep. So essentially the state will say that this is the ceiling for regulation and that there can be no divergence from this, regardless of whether elected officials on lower levels of government have differing initiatives or differing political wills in their own jurisdictions. And part of how this has been an issue in gun violence prevention, especially with political violence, is if there are heavily populous jurisdictions that exist within states that that are broadly less receptive to firearms regulation, then these preemption laws prevent these cities and other larger urban centers from being able to craft policies to help protect their populace, their constituents, from risks that may be more unique to their specific environment, less so on the broader state level. And it's critical that as we're looking at all of these recommendations and more, we ensure that we're considering not just the fact that this is political violence, but how, as Representative Raskin, Lily Mason, Darrell Miller, and others have been saying, that we acknowledge that there is an inseparable intersection between politicized violence and racial animus that informs the violence or the willingness to engage in that violence. And so to that point, we've heard some recommendations from Lily Mason as well as Representative Raskin about the promotion of culture change. And this is something anyone can do without the need of a legislative body. And that is because as Lily Mason has shown, when leaders insinuate that violence is okay, and even trusted peers, it reinforces permission structures to people who follow or trust those people that this is conduct that they can participate in, and that this is the culture that we are existing in, and that is something that we all take part in collectively creating culture, and thus we are all empowered to make some changes about it. And so as the news or shared experience of the world in this presentation has stated, the risk of armed political violence in the United States, especially fueled by racial animus, is not hypothetical, but neither are the solutions to it. Legislators can and should pass recommended policies to protect civil rights, public welfare, and the integrity of our democracy. And we as members of the public can help give them every reason to do such.
Great, thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for those very clear and specific recommendations. And the link to the report that Tim co-authored is in the chat, so I'll direct people to that report for additional information. I want to thank everybody for posting questions so far. I'll start to work through them. I want to begin with this question that I'll turn to Darrell first, but certainly welcome other panelists to answer as well. Darrell, there's a question that says, how can we quantify the effect that white supremacist violence, political violence, and guns in spaces essential to democracy have on participation in public life? Right? Do you think it affects people's decisions on whether to vote, for example, or even engage in the political process?
I mean, I don't have the data, but anecdotally, it seems like it does. And I think the key here is a couple things. One is that we have a really somewhat distorted view about the costs of gun violence. We think of them in terms of what shows up at the hospital or what shows up in the morgue. But there's all kinds of hidden costs that we don't have the tools yet, but are developing the tools to calibrate and to assess, which is who stops going to the polling place, who stops engaging in the political process, who ends up not running for office or running for or volunteering to be the local elections official. These are all definite costs to the health of our democracy that don't get assessed, don't get analyzed, and that's kind of what the research agenda for a kind of pro-democracy future needs to be about in an environment where we have a lot of people carrying guns. So that's one aspect. The other thing I think I will mention is it's not really an answer to say, well, if one group brings their guns, another group should bring theirs, and then some kind of happy equilibrium will arise. Because again, you're then discounting all the people that say, I don't want to show up to places with guns, right? Even if some in my camp are there with guns, I'm just not going to show up. It is a net drag on democratic accountability and participation.
Great, thank you, Darrell. Let me see if other panelists have any thoughts on the effect that white supremacist violence, political violence, and guns in spaces have on the democracy and participation in public life. Yeah, Representative Raskin, I see your hands up.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to this point that the proliferation of gun violence and attacks in public places, specifically on public officials and their family members, discourages people from going into politics or running for office. And what this means is we get a greater prevalence of people with extremist ideas running for office in the first place, as other people are just scared out of the arena. So don't underestimate what that means to the future of our politics, that people feel like it's just a completely surly, toxic environment that they'd be getting themselves into.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. A really important point too about just people not even willing to raise their hand to even run for office because of fear of violence and other harms. Let me move on to another question. Lily, lots of questions about your book, and certainly you made a comment about how we need condemnation of violence by our leaders, and just wondering if you can speak a little bit to what we need to do. What do we need to be calling on our leaders, our political leaders, community, to really say we have to condemn these acts across the board, all political parties, and also really target the disinformation that's really fueling this violence. I mean, has your research highlighted anything in this space, or do you have some perspectives here on this that we can lift up for the audience today?
Yeah, I mean, the most powerful thing is for leaders, when violence occurs, for leaders to come out quickly and say, this is not part of a democracy. This is not how we behave as members of a democracy. A lot of the nonviolence that we have in any democracy is really rooted in norms, and norms are enforced via social sanctions. And so what we need to see is not necessarily a formal vote of censure, although that would help. If it's a member of Congress that's actually, either engaging in the violence or encouraging violence. But for the rest of the leaders, particularly in the same party, to say to the public and to that person, this is not acceptable. This is not how democracy works. This is not how power is transferred. We don't behave this way here. And to the extent that there are increasingly high levels of approval in the electorate, approval of violence, that's creating less less social sanction against violent behavior or violent rhetoric in regular places, in regular people's lives with their family and their friends and their neighbors. And so what we've also seen is that regular people can do this as well. When people read a Twitter message from a stranger, for example, basically saying that violence is not acceptable, they tend to step back also. So even regular social condemnation of pro-violent behavior or pro-violent attitudes can reduce people's approval of violence. And then the last thing that I'll say is that we also, as Democrats and Republicans, tend to overestimate the extent to which people in the other party are violent. And when we correct those misperceptions, people tend to back off. Because they're not as afraid that they have to defend themselves against these violent people on the other side. So correcting misperceptions, basically saying that's not who we are, right? Like, look, this is not us, can actually make people on the other side kind of calm down a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I assume to us as citizens can also amplify those messages as well. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, thank you. There are several questions related to Supreme Court decisions, and I wanted to ask Tim and Darrell a couple of questions here. It's first of all, how or sort of what does the Supreme Court decisions in Bruen in particular change, or how does it change how we can address armed white supremacy, firearms, and political violence, particularly thinking about Bruen case?
Well, I can start, and Darrell, I welcome you to step in after me. Principally, what the Bruen opinion did that was the most significant, at least in terms of what we're looking at as legal scholars and practitioners, is it essentially changed the way that courts are allowed to review Second Amendment cases, whereas before the Bruen opinion, lower courts had coalesced around this two-part test of sorts where whenever a law was being evaluated that implicated the Second Amendment, courts first had to evaluate, well, does the regulation of that is at issue in this case, does it implicate the Second Amendment or a core aspect of the Second Amendment right? And then if so, it goes to a second step where it looks to the depth of the regulation in comparison to the governmental interest that's weighed against, which was often like public health and safety. Like, yes, preventing a firearm from being held by a certain person or in a certain space does impact the Second Amendment right. However, because there's such a compelling governmental interest for having firearms not be in certain spaces or certain times or being held by certain individuals, then that constitutionally justifies this regulation, makes it permissible. The Supreme Court was adamant in its latest in the Bruen case to try and change that governmental interest aspect, which instead attempted to ground the analysis much more in history, as in looking into the first and kind of change the two-part test to a different framing, where first the one side would have to state why or how a certain regulation implicates the Second Amendment based on historical understanding of it. And then the burden would shift to the government and others to try and demonstrate why or how this law can be tied meaningfully to historical analogs or historical tradition of firearms regulation. So essentially an attempt to root our analysis of gun cases much more in the past than in the present. I want to provide Darrell Miller with an opportunity to provide more perspectives on that as well before we talk further about the implications of such tests.
Yeah, I mean, right now the jury's out. The metaphorical jury, I suppose, is out on what was going to happen post-Bruen. The change to essentially running every regulation through some kind of historical analog machine is really thrown open the floodgates, because lots of things that we have in the 21st century did not exist in 1791. There are no airplanes. There's no subways. The crime of domestic violence doesn't exist in 1791, or doesn't exist the way we understand it today. So all these things are on the table. Now, could be room to despair, but it also, to the extent that there's some general kind of principle behind these regulations, whether it's sort of democracy protecting, whether it's about protecting children, whether it's about protecting, the electoral process, or the channels of free, independent exchange. To the extent that the reasons why these things are analogous becomes what is focused on, maybe there would be opportunities to have a kind of common sense regulatory regime, but it's going to take some time. The other thing that I think I'll mention is it's not just Bruin, it is the the run up to Bruin and the legislative impacts of reducing in many states the regulations on carrying guns, so that it becomes much more ambiguous when a person shows up at a polling place with their sidearm. Are they there to intimidate somebody, or are they just there sort of exercising their interest in self-defense? And this is why I think people thinking in this area need to really think about the trade-offs, the rights versus the rights dynamic that is developing in our society. It's not just gun rights and self-defense versus some general amorphous regulatory interest. It's gun rights versus a right to vote free of intimidation. It's a gun rights versus a right to peaceably assemble to register your political ideas. It is a gun right against many states have rights to a free and fair and quality education. It's rights versus rights trade-offs, not just rights versus regulation trade-offs, that is going to be the key to understanding this dynamic in the future.
Great, thank you very much. We have time just for a couple more questions. I want to, Darrell, while you have the floor, I want to ask a follow-up question, a little bit broader too. We have some advocates on this webinar, and certainly one notes the challenges of wrestling with the problem of racial disparities and racism and the enforcement of gun regulations. How do you sort of think about that with the tension of a belief by some that we need stronger gun regulations for the common good? How do we address the fact that there is this tension, that there is racism in the enforcement of gun regulations, and also we need stronger gun regulations for the common good? This is a perspective somebody asked if you can comment on.
Right. So I guess there was a version of this in the chat that I'll give the same answer, which is one is avoid paralysis. The easy thing to do in the face of really hard trade-offs is just not do anything. But not doing things is a choice, right? So not choosing to regulate is a choice, and that has costs as well. So the way I think about this is, it's not, first of all, you have to have a 360-degree perspective about what are the costs. There are costs to legislating, there are costs to not legislating. Are you accounting for all the costs that go into this policy decision about whether you actually do something or not, or you advocate for something or not? The second is sort of thinking about, institutional design. Not all kinds of gun violence prevention metrics or measures have to be punitive. Not all kinds of gun violence prevention measures have to be criminal. So thinking about this in a lot more creative way is one way of addressing it. Maybe the problem isn't, the person who might legitimately say, look, I'm scared. I live in a high crime neighborhood. That's why I've got this gun, and I'm going to carry it whether I have a license or not because I'm scared, as opposed to the upstream thing about what is the set of circumstances that basically creates the person to have that gun, and what can you do to mitigate those kinds of things.
Great, thank you very much. And I know we're running short on time. We could have this conversation for a whole nother hour. I wanted to just make some space for any sort of final thoughts from our panelists. And again, we will respond to some of these other questions we didn't get to today, but let me see if Representative Raskin or Lily or Tim or Darrell have any comments you want to leave the audience with today as they move on from this conversation, take this conversation with them, help enact change and lead change. So let me see if Representative Raskin, if you have anything to leave our audience with today.
Yeah, thank you so much for including me. And I'm sorry I've had to tune out to go do other things at different points, but this is just a vital and extremely important session that you've done. We've got to get the word out that liberal democracy in America is under siege the way it's under siege all over the world. And here, violent white nationalism and out of control gun violence are both undermining the basic foundations of democracy. So I'll leave everybody with thoughts of two people. One, Frederick Douglass, who said, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. And the struggle may be physical, maybe moral, maybe physical and moral, but there must be struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and it never has. So there's a message to you from a great 19th century Marylander. And then Tom Paine, who wrote this pamphlet in 1776 called The Crisis, just to try to give everybody hope to get through the revolution, even though people are saying you can't beat the tyrants and the kings and the queens and the bullies and so on. And he had this passage. I'm going to update it pursuant to instructions from Speaker Pelosi, but he said, these are the times that try men and women's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink at this moment from the service of their cause in their country, but everyone that stands with us now will win the love and favor and affection of every man and every woman for all time. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, but we have this saving consolation. The more difficult the struggle, the more glorious in the end will be our victory. So thanks very much for including me.
Great, thanks for those comments. Tim?
And to finish off what Representative Raskin expertly set up, I want to reiterate that all of the words we've spoken today, far from being empty, are heavy with promise and potential. We've heard of work ongoing in the Capitol. We've heard of work ongoing in the courts and legislatures and research universities across the nation that are all approaching the similar issue from different angles. And even though this issue of racialized political violence and the intersection it has with weapons and the current state of our democracy is remarkably complex, because there are so many intersectional issues presenting themselves, each of those issues provides a myriad of solutions that could be raised to help address it. I think between court action, legislative action, and community action on behalf of all of us and our relations to each other, there is ample room to make change and meaningful growth here that I think we're all empowered to step forward and do.
Great, thanks, Tim. Lily, do you have any final words for us today?
Yeah, I think in the same vein, I think it's important to remember that across the span of American history, generally, we don't have transitions towards a lot more equality in a peaceful way. Right? We had, thriving Black communities of Reconstruction, which was followed by 70 years of Jim Crow. We had the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, followed by the long Southern strategy from the Republican Party. We had Barack Obama followed by Donald Trump. And it's definitely, one of the things that is potentially currently happening is that we are in another one of these large steps forward, living through the backlash. And that doesn't mean that we should give up. It means that we should actually try harder. But understanding that Americans have done this before and they've been met with terrible backlash before, and that if we are actually in a moment like this where we've uncovered so much inequality, so much even just from the Black Lives Matter to the Me Too movements, right? Things that had been secret before that are now out in the open. If we're moving towards this greater equality, we shouldn't be surprised that we're in a moment that's this threatening and challenging.
Great, thank you. And Darrell, final word. If you have anything to add before we wrap up.
Yeah, I guess the final word really is comes from the book that Joseph and I wrote, which is, most people, whether it's about sort of political violence or about gun use or about self-defense or something, have fairly moderate and common sense intuitions about it. It is just giving them and what essentially is their majority views access to make their policy, their preferences into policy.
Great. And with that, I want to just say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Darrell Miller, Tim Carey, Representative Raskin, and Lilliana Mason for your expertise. And thank you to everyone for making time in your day to be here today. A recording of this session will be available and shared afterwards. And again, just please join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you everyone for being here. Take care and stay well.